welcome everyone to this event. Please note that the session is being recorded, and if there are any mobile phones that are still on, if you could switch them off, that would be great. First of all, on behalf of Alitra, I haven't done this before. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country on which we're meeting, their connections to land, sea and community, as well as their unique contributions to this university and the wider community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and emerging, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people here today. Second, a word about Alitra. Through its activities, as we nearly all know, Alitra promotes an interest in all aspects of literary translation. We also distribute news of events and anything else relevant to translators, and we publish an online journal, the Alitra Review. So if you're not already a member of Alitra, please join forthwith.
Very cheap.
Via the website or by approaching any of us. This evening's event will take the form of a general conversation, a kind of Q&A variation on about literary translation. Historically, of course, translators haven't fared very well. Think of Jerome, the patron saint of translators, who produced the first Latin Bible in the 4th century. The Roman clergy were not pleased by his decision to translate the Hebrew into the everyday Latin of Romans. He was forced to flee Rome and complete his translation in exile. John Wycliffe, responsible for the first English Bible in the 14th century, also believed that the good book should be written in a language fully comprehensible to his countrymen. The Anglican Church arranged for his corpse to be dug up and his bones burned for heresy.
The good old days, as we call it in the tradition. Yeah.
In the early 16th century, just as the revolution in printing was sweeping Europe, William Tyndale's translation of the Bible appeared. Tyndale was sentenced to death, of course, first strangled and then burned at the stake. Now, punishment through death and exile has tended, I think, to diminish over the years as a critical response to the work of translators. But translation has long been an area of literature that is too often ignored, misunderstood or misrepresented. Publishers and reviewers, as we know, still often behave as if translators don't exist, and of course translators are notoriously very badly paid. But in recent years, indeed decades, there's been increasing recognition of the creativity of translation. I was once asked to define literary translation and to comment on its significance in 100 words. I just fished that out. I wrote, "Literary translation is one of the central acts of human communication. It's not only a cultural necessity, but also a distinctive form of creative writing. A translation is a reading of a literary work, and it is a literary work. The translator strives to write a literary work in which the writing reaches the artistic level of the original. Translation gives life to the work it translates. It performs it, interprets it, and transforms it imaginatively in order to connect it with a new cultural space. This process goes to the heart of the enterprise of literature itself. Literature itself is partly sustained through the agency of translation." And these and related matters will be discussed this evening by Lilit Thwaites and our guest, Danny Hahn. Lilit is the current president of Alitra, as you know, an award-winning translator from Spanish. Her translations include the best-selling The Librarian of Auschwitz and 2 novels by Rosa Montero, Tears in Rain and Weight of the Heart, and in 2016 she was awarded Spain's Cross of the Order of Civil Merit for her promotion of Spain's literatures and cultures in Australia. Danny is an award-winning translator, writer, editor, with over 100 books to his name so far. He translates from Portuguese, Spanish and French. He's worked on everything from Pele's autobiography to children's picture books. His translation of the Angolan writer José Eduardo Agualusa's novel, A General Theory of Oblivion, was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize in 2016, and it won the International Dublin Award. He's currently compiling a collection of Brazilian short stories, translating a Colombian classic, and writing a book about translations of Shakespeare. He's been and remains highly active as a promoter of literary translation. He's a past chair of the Society of Authors, the Writers' Union of the UK, and the UK Translators Association. Over to you.
And I'll add one more thing that
Thank you.
perhaps even Danny hasn't had a chance to catch up on yet, and that is that your translation of The Living and the Rest has just been long-listed for the Oxford Weidenfeld Prize. So congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you, yes.
That popped in my mailbox today.
Good.
Timing.
Excellent. It's very fresh, the one.
Now, Daniel managed to give me and Brian a bit of a fright today by sending a text message which said, "My flight has been cancelled from Sydney." They will be finding me another one, which fortunately they did. So I'm going to give you a bit of a surprise and a shock and ask you,
Oh, great.
have you ever met the Queen, especially, for instance, when you were given your OBE?
I have never met the Queen. The Queen came to my school when I was like 13 or something, because they were opening a new science building. And Prince Philip is the one who wandered around and said things that no one remembers. The OBE I was granted an OBE when the Queen was still alive. I went and received it from Princess Anne after the Queen had died. And so I must be, I think, the only person who has ever had a conversation about literary translation with Princess Anne. It's not a thing that I think she talks about very much. And the conversation went, she was sort of amazing. They do this thing where they kind of parade you in and you have like 58 seconds to talk to them. And then the next you get whisked off to the next person. And so she has to do 58 seconds on literary translation and then services to the automotive industry and then nursing and then something else. And so that, they start with a very general question. And the question she asked me was something like, she didn't say, who the hell are you, which is obviously what she was thinking, or what do you do? She said something like, how do you define what you do? Which I thought was really smart.
Yeah.
She'd had like 5 seconds to prepare because someone, an elderly white man with a posh voice said, "Daniel Hahn OBE services to literature," and then I kind of walked in. So she had like the 10 steps to go, now which one is literature? And then she asked this question, and I said, I do stuff with books and translation, and here in the UK we're very bad at being interested in other people's culture. So I did a little pitch,
Yeah.
And
she didn't offer to donate money for a translation prize?
Curiously not. I mean, I feel like that would be quite a commitment, because then 58 seconds later she'd have to donate money to the automotive industry, and then,
True.
I'm not sure I was that persuasive. But yes, I feel like take every opportunity to be selling this thing.
Absolutely.
One day someone will buy it.
Which is what you are an expert at, incredibly so. But maybe we can go back and start at the beginning. So tell us a little bit about yourself and how it was that you got, in the end, into literary translation, and in particular, the 3 languages that you translate from, Spanish, Portuguese, and French.
It's interesting that you say sort of in the end, because it is one of those things that seems inevitable now, though it wasn't at the time. I was brought up with immigrant parents in the UK. My mother's from Brazil, her first language is Portuguese. My father from Argentina, first language is Spanish. So I was born in the UK, but I was brought up in London with languages, sort of with those 2 languages particularly around me always. I only spoke English at home. It was my parents' common language, and I still only speak English to my parents. I've never yet had a conversation with either of them in any other language. Yeah. But those languages were, in the air around me. So I was used to hearing them. I was used to consuming them. I've been going to Brazil my whole life because my mum was part of a big family, and I had, grandparents and stuff. And and I spoke English to everyone in Brazil because I'm lazy and embarrassed. But surrounded by the languages as a consumer. It didn't occur to me, for reasons I don't understand now, that translation would be a sensible thing for me to do. But I did an English degree, so I was a literature person. I was a very bookish child. I did an English degree. And actually, until relatively recently, certainly in the UK, but I think in a lot of the English-speaking world, there weren't that many people who, at the age of 18, set out to be literary translators. You know, you're a writer, or you work in publishing, or you're an editor, or you're a reader, and someone asks you as a favor to do a bit of translation, and before you know it, this is the thing you're doing. And that was what happened with me. I was, in fact, writing my first book. This is 20-odd years ago. I was reading books for publishers in the UK who couldn't read the languages that I could read. I read this Angola novel by Agualusa, whom you mentioned, the person who wrote The Living and the Rest. I read this one book, said this is totally brilliant to the publisher, you absolutely should publish it. And the editor said, well, do you want to translate it? And I said, yeah.
Why not?
How hard, you know. And actually, and in a funny way, I don't think I found it that difficult, but it hadn't occurred to me, like I didn't have any reason to worry about it, but hadn't given it nearly enough thought to worry about it. And so I translated it, and it was quite fun, with no intention of doing another one. And then, I think 4 years later, that was 2002 or 2, I think. And then 4 years later, the same publisher came back to me and said, we thought we'd do another book by the same guy. That was all right, wasn't it? And I did a second book by Agualusa, and that one did well, and it won a prize, and it got sort of noticed. And I've been translating, not full-time, but pretty regularly since then. But it's funny thinking about what felt incredibly sort of random, and just, you know, I happened to be talking to an editor who happened to need it. I mean, actually, the second book I translated, the Pele autobiography that Brian mentioned, it happened literally because I had written my first book. An editor at Simon & Schuster had published it. He bought the Pele autobiography and called me and said, you are the only person I know who speaks Portuguese. Do you want to translate it? And so now, you know, I can pretend that it was all very kind of tidy, and it sort of somehow seems very tidy.
Do you know anything about football?
No. And actually, I translated my second football book 2 years ago, which means I also have translated 2 books that have sold some copies, obviously. Everything else is massively undersold, and these 2 football books sold incredibly well. But it means that I have now translated the same number of football books as I have been to professional football matches. I have attended 2, and I now don't know whether I should try and do one more of one or the other. I don't know which is better. And maybe I should do one more book so I can say that I've translated more football books. I've been to 2 professional football matches, one of them in Australia, rather surprisingly.
Well, there you go.
I saw England play Brazil 20 years ago at Wembley, and I saw the Socceroos playing Korea at the, is it Asia Pacific Cup or something? Is that what it's called? 6 or 7 years ago in Sydney. And the translator of Pele's autobiography and the autobiography of Arsene Wenger,
That's right.
22-year manager of Arsenal.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think you must know what this is like. This is like, I know nothing about football. I knew nothing about football when I started. But there was a period of like 20 minutes when I knew everything. And this happens with, 2 years ago, I translated a book by a neuroscientist. And I was like, I knew maybe 15 minutes, but I knew like everything about neuroscience. And then, of course, it gets displaced by Arsene Wenger or paleontology, which is the book that came after that, or something else.
Okay, but what as a translator now, what are the basic skills, apart from the 15 minutes of expertise, that you actually think, feel that translators need to have or ought to have? The job is reading and the job is writing. It's in some ways not more complicated than that. When I'm translating an Angola novel, my job is to be a particular kind of close and sensitive reader of the Portuguese, and a supple, flexible, confident writer of English. And it doesn't. One could make it more mysterious than that, but I don't think it is much more mysterious than that. I think you have to work out what's happening, and then you have to do the same thing. All of the words are different, but otherwise these 2 things are identical. Right? 2 identical books, but for the words. And
And often the difference between, I mean, I often think the difference between the good translators and the great translators is what kind of writer they are, often.
So background knowledge of either the country or the era or so on is not...
I think it varies, but I think if you're working, I mean, like us with a language with a language that spans so many places. I have friends who translate from. I lived in Athens for a year, and I have a little bit of Greek, not to translate, but I have functional kind of Greek. And I have friends who translate from Greek, and they can know that culture because it is almost entirely spoken, with the exception of a big diaspora community in a place like Melbourne. The sort of Greek-speaking community, the Greek-speaking population is substantially in a single country. It's not a huge country. Yeah. It's 9 million, 10 million people. It's a culture in which one can become familiar with. And becoming familiar with the culture of the Spanish, Portuguese, and French-speaking worlds
is huge.
And I've translated 9 books by one Angolan writer. I am yet to go to Angola. I'm waiting to be invited. I'm desperate to go to Angola, but it's incredibly expensive. But not being an expert in that cultural life there are workarounds, and I do research, and I have very amenable writers and so forth. There are certain cases where having a particular expertise is really useful, and where I think I am the right person for this particular book because I have a certain expertise. But a lot of the time in these languages, unless I were going to say I'm translating Portuguese, but only from Brazil, and really only from Rio, because actually Brazil is also enormous and various, and there's lots of Brazil I don't know. There's lots of Rio I don't know. So there's a lot of faking it, actually, is what it is. I think of a more... No, there's a lot of, instinct and all kind of other things, and faking it.
It's a slight exaggeration, given the prizes that you've won. And
I'm very good at... I'm not saying I'm not good at faking it. I mean, I'm very persuasive.
Clearly.
Just don't tell anyone.
All right, so modus operandi, because I think given that a lot of people who are here are actually translators themselves, it will be interesting to hear. So I was, in fact, for instance, not surprised. Okay, when I translate, I read the book from start to finish first. When you translate, I gather, you don't at all.
No.
Okay.
So when you say you were surprised, do you mean you were
appalled,
secretly appalled?
No, not appalled. It is a completely different way of operating. For me, getting to the end means that I've got some sort of feel for tone and all that sort of thing. But presumably you then would be going back and doing...
Well, that's the thing. I think if I were obliged to do a book in a single draft, then the way I work would be incredibly reckless. But I do prefer, where possible. I mean, often it happens that I have read the book already. Often it's a book that I maybe have pitched to a publisher, or I have read just for my own pleasure in any case. But if I have the opportunity to translate without having read it first, I do love working like that, partly because it makes the first draft much more interesting to me. I don't like first drafts very much. I love everything that comes after. I love the edit, and I can sort of talk through the process if that's interesting. But that first draft I found very tiresome, and it's much more fun if you're reading the book. It's much more fun if you're discovering characters and voice and plot. Like I'll be 9/10 of the way through translating a book and I don't know who dies at the end. I mean, it really is that experience of being a reader. And there is, and I write something about it in this book, which we'll talk about. There's a particular kind of electricity that comes with your first contact with a book that is not the same, however much you love it, it's not the same when you reread it. And there are some books that are amazing to reread, and there are some books that are better as you reread them, certainly. But there is a thing of discovery that is different to a second, third, fourth, fifth read. And so for me, that first draft, which I do very fast, I'll do a first draft, 5,000-6,000 words a day, and it's more or less unreadable. It's just terrible. But it's to have something. It's more or less at the speed at which I type, and I don't look stuff up, and I leave words in the original, and I leave notes to myself, and I try not to make any decisions. If I don't immediately see what to do with this word, I will leave myself 3 options, or leave it in the original language, or whatever. So it's just to get something down on the page. So I'll get the first draft done really quickly. sort of as I would, more or less as I would if reading it, or indeed writing it. I think it's also, it has some things in common with writing as well as some things in common with reading, that you're following characters and voices and that sort of thing. And then get to the end, look up all of the things that are missing and make some decisions and plug lots and lots of gaps, because it's chaos before that. And then there's the process of reading from end to end over and over and seeing what are the things that snag and seeing what are the things you need to change. But those are the bits I really like. And so the first draft is I reward myself with something closer to a reading experience, and I do it, like I say, very, very fast. But I can rationalize. I mean, I could find some kind of justification for the ways in which it improves the work, but actually it's a personality thing. It's that I get very impatient if I'm bored, whereas I'm incredibly patient with edits, and I can look at I could look at a paragraph for ages once it's there and once I have some sense of what I'm trying to find in it.
Does that then, going back and looking at and figuring, does that differ for you depending on the author and the text and or the language?
It doesn't differ much language to language. It does differ author to author, but one of the things that's happened, because I've been doing this for a while now, I have a lot of writers who are my sort of, the recidivist writers, as it were. Agualusa, I've done 9 books. There are quite a few writers for whom I've done 3, 4, 5 books. And it's certainly true that if I'm doing an edit for a new Agualusa book, I have some sense, I have something in my ear already. I mean, I know what he sounds like in English because he's been in English for 15 years, and I made that.
And it's you.
And it's me, and I know what he sounds like. There's a Guatemalan writer called Eduardo Halfon. We've done 4 books together and many other things, and also I know him personally. He's an English speaker, and I know what he sounds like. And so I have, with writers like that, there isn't much sort of discovering the voice, because the voice is quite even in every book. They're not doing radically different things in each book, for the most part. It's very different if I'm doing something, someone who is new to me, or someone who plays around with different kinds of voices, or whatever it might be. But that's a question of what the writer is doing, much more than a question of the language or even the genre. I mean, fiction can work like that. I do a lot of children's books, and that sounds like the kettle's on or something.
Sounds like a bird or a frog or something.
Sounds like one of those very, very old, the modem used to sound like that, like someone's dial-up or something. Someone's expecting a fax, maybe.
Asking
anyway.
you questions. Okay, consultation with authors.
Yeah.
Do you do a lot? Not at all?
I do as much as I can. I mean, I think one of the things, for those of us who translate into English, we have a better chance of having authors who speak the language into which we are translating, on the whole, compared to people working in the other direction. And I always invite my authors to be involved. They don't always take me up on it, but they almost always do. But I do always write. Typically, if I was working on a new author now, I would write and say, delighted to be translating your novel. I hope you are delighted also that I'm translating your novel. I will have a pretty good draft by the middle of September. I'll send it to you if you want to comment on it. And they'll have the opportunity to read an entire draft from end to end if they want to. Like I say, they sometimes don't, but I feel like it is reassuring to them that I am not hiding anything, that I've made the offer. Yeah. And I will typically send them a draft that is maybe 1 or 2 drafts before whatever goes to the publisher. So there'll be a few queries, there'll be a few things maybe marked for them, some actual questions in the margin and so forth. But again, having worked with quite a few authors repeatedly, we have particular ways of working, and there are some people who like to be involved at various stages all the way through. There are some people who just want you to send a Word document with some questions. They will answer their question to get on with it. Most of my authors are incredibly patient with me. And there are some with whom I've been working for such a long time. When I was doing the Living and the Rest, the Agualusa book, our 8th or 9th book, I wrote to him at one point, I was in the middle of a draft, and said, I've just come across this word on page 87, I've never seen this before. You know, translating you for nearly 20 years, and I can't find it online. And he wrote back to me this email which sounded like a sort of, you know, we're an old married couple. He sent an email back which began, "I'm so pleased I can still surprise you." Like after all these years,
Yeah.
he still found
Something.
something, just to kind of keep it, you know, to keep the flame alive. I had one of the writers I worked with a few times is a Brazilian writer called Juan. We did a book called Resistance and a book called Occupation, which are really wonderful books. And with Resistance, Juan was immensely, his English is wonderful actually. He was immensely patient with me, and he read an entire draft and commented on it, and then I sent him an email with questions, and then I sent him an email with other questions. And there came a point where I sent him an email saying, so that statue on page 56, you talk about the arms, like in exactly what position are the arms of this statue? And he wrote back and explained, he answered my question very patiently, and then he said, by the way, Danny, I'm really pleased that the fact that we are talking about such small details does suggest that most of the important stuff has been done now, doesn't it? I went, which is like the most gracious way of saying, just leave me the fuck alone. But they are, on the whole, they're very patient with me, and it is a very, as you know, it can be a very intimate relationship. There are people I work with for a long time. I spend a lot of time, you know, living inside the heads of these people. You know, because it's not like, you know, you read a book in 8 hours. I will spend 3 months in a book, or much longer sometimes. And so, particularly once you've reached the point where they have learned to trust you, when that happens, and it can be this very intimate thing. It's really nice having them as part of it, I think. There are some who, you know,
Don't want to know.
I mean, I don't think I've had anyone who. I don't think of anyone who sort of refused to engage, but I've had some people who said, if you have questions, send me your questions, I'll answer them.
So what about if you don't necessarily agree with some of the things that they've sent to you, back to you?
Of course that never happens because they're all lovely, he said, mindful of the fact that our conversation's being recorded. It's so that one of the ways in which I think I'm lucky with my authors is not only they are very nice and they are very amenable, and that on the whole their English is quite good, but I think that most of them also understand what my job is. They understand what is entailed in translating something, and therefore they will understand, if they trust me, that if I'm doing something which is different, I mean, all of it's different, all the words are different, but if I'm doing something that is conspicuously different, there is a reason for it, and I can normally explain to them what that reason is. And so if we do engage in a conversation in which they say, you know, you appear to have missed out this phrase, or you seem to have moved these things around, I mean, sometimes they're right and sometimes it's a mistake, but I can usually say, actually, the problem is, if I were to keep the structure of that sentence in English, this would be a problem because the reader wouldn't know that these two things are relating to each other, because it's obvious in Portuguese because it's a gendered language and it's obvious this adjective refers to this noun, but in English that isn't the case, and so I need to restructure the sentence to make sure the information all connects in a kind of, like the architecture of the sentence works like that. And if I can explain that, that's normally fine. I have one of the writers I mentioned, Eduardo Halfon, who's Guatemalan. He grew up partly in the US. His English is amazing. He writes in English as well. And he's the person with whom I've had, my co-translator, Lisa Dillman, and I have had the most sort of intensive...
discussion.
Yeah, let's go with intensive. Most intensive discussions, because he has a really clear sense of what he sounds like, what he wants to sound like in English. And it's much more sophisticated than, you know, you're doing something different in English to Spanish. He actually could be making this in English himself if he chose to. But that is not normal. On the whole, people, I think, have a relatively realistic sense of the limitations of their English, however accomplished they might be as a second, third language.
Now, you mentioned that you've done, and you have done several books now, with one, or in one case, I think 4 of you translating. 5, okay. How does that work?
I love co-translating. That was
Does that
the one
come out
with,
of your mentoring? originally?
sort of. A lot of the time it does. The sort of extreme co-translation, that 5-person one, was actually the first book we did by the same Guatemalan writer, Eduardo Halfon. There were 5 of us: Lisa Dillman, Anne McLean, Ollie Brock, Tom Bunstead, and me. All very quickly co-translating this Guatemalan book, a very short book. It's not even that it was, 1,000 pages long. It was very short, 140 pages or something. And we did that in a very, we basically each did a first draft of different things and then had this, what we call a carousel edit, where everything got edited by everyone. I have an incredibly complicated spreadsheet, which I still have kept on my laptop, which was taking account of the fact that we were going to, all 5 of us were going to edit all of the bits of this over about 10 days. But taking account of the fact that Anne was in Toronto and Lisa was in Georgia, and Ollie and Tom and I were all in the UK, but we kept quite different hours. And so it was perfectly possible to have, I think the book was being edited 24/7. There were 10 days in which there wasn't a moment when there wasn't someone working on some bit of this book. Very efficient. The thing that surprised me about that, and that always surprises me, continues to surprise me about co-translation, is how much better the work is. I think I assumed that, like a lot of, it's easy to make this assumption about, producing creative work by committee, that you'd end up with something that is a bit sort of lifeless, that, everyone takes out the bits they're not sure about, and you end up with almost nothing. Where you end up with just like meaning, and meaning isn't terribly important actually in a lot of novels. But there was so much. In that case, it worked partly because we all had, each of us separately had worked on the author before. We all knew his work, because he's someone who has a very clear sense of how he has to sound in English, and therefore we all had an idea of that voice and Iris as well. But a lot of the co-translations I've done, other than for him, have been, as you said, sort of related to mentoring, in the sense that when I get asked to do a book that I very much want to do and don't have time for, or that I very much want to do, but I know that there's an early career translator who's been pitching this book and really wanted to have a go at it, I'll often invite someone to do it with me. And so I've done 10, 15 co-translations, I suppose. And they all work in slightly different ways. The one I've done relatively recently, which is the Millás Arzuaga book published by Scribe here in Melbourne, is a co-translation with Tom Bunstead, and the book is sort of in 2 voices, and so actually kind of lends itself to I did one bit of it. There's a copy around there somewhere.
Yeah,
Death as Told by a Sapiens. That's the one. Yes. Sapiens to a Neanderthal.
Preceded by life.
Preceded by life, and to be followed, I believe, by consciousness. I think that is the 3rd and final one. I hope we will do that. And then we've done life, death. We've done. That's pretty good coverage, I feel.
Yeah.
Like life, death, and consciousness. Yes. If there's anything else, let me know. But I think we're doing all right. But that one is sort of in voices, and so it kind of fell naturally into two roles. Sometimes what happens is one person will do the first draft. So I've done a couple of books with an early career translator called Noel Hernandez Gonzalez. We've done 2 books by a Venezuelan writer, and Noel always does the first draft, which is what he actually enjoys, for reasons I don't understand, and I get to do all the bits that I enjoy. There have been cases where we've alternated chapters.
So how do you get a continuous voice at the end? Is that just the final edit?
It's partly to do with how the edit happened and how many rounds of edits there are. The first Millás book I co-translated with Tom, we each produced a version of the first few pages and sat down. Conveniently, Tom lived around the corner from me, so we sat down a couple of evenings and looked at 2 versions of the opening of the novel and made some decisions. Some strategy decisions, as it were. Exactly how formal is this going to be? Exactly. It was a quite unusual narrative voice, but we wanted to work out, how high voltage will the expletives be, or whatever. So we made a few decisions like that, and so we had some sense already of what we were doing. And then I edit his, and he edits mine. And then, in the case of the books I've done with Tom, we have almost always also sat in a room and read them aloud.
Yeah.
all together, like
Reading aloud
from end to end, including the Death book, which is not a short book. But doing that together, you notice different things, and also you start to tune into what the other person's going to notice. But I think it also depends on, I wouldn't co-translate with just anyone. I agree to do it with people with whom I think my tastes are similar and what I'm trying to do is similar. And I have a lot of friends who translate whose work I admire enormously, and I think we'd be totally incompatible. But I think we're just not trying to do the same thing. Whereas when I've read, Tom's solo translations or Lisa's or Andrew's or whoever, what I think is I wish I could do that. That's exactly what I would be doing if only I could.
Now, I'm aware that the clock's ticking, and we will leave some time for questions. However, I want to get onto this book, and I also want Daniel to read a little bit from here, because this is actually, well, you explain, because you.
It's my fault, yeah.
It's called Catching Fire, a translation diary. Okay.
So this is the third time I've done. A few years ago, I was just signed a contract to translate a book by a Chilean writer called Hahn Lilit Thwaites. The book was called Jamás el fuego nunca. And I was doing this for Charco Press, an Edinburgh-based publisher who do only Latin American fiction. And I asked them if I could keep basically write a blog on their website to allow people to follow the process of my translation of the book. And I've done that a couple of times before, just writing, 24 posts over the course of a few months so that people can follow the process. And the idea is to write about the experience of translating it, not to write about what it's like to be a translator, but to do something quite concrete, to write about phrases and challenges and sentences and the title, and this is a recurring issue, and I hate the author today because she keeps doing this thing with this adjective and the ambiguity and the terrible things. Terrible people, authors. And so the idea was to do something which was about, what I think about translation and making people understand how I see it, but doing it in as concrete a way as possible. And so the first post was going to be so I'm translating this book by the Hahn Lilit Thwaites. I wonder what it's like. I will let you know. And then the last post was 3 months later, when I'm, 20 years older. And the post ends with, I'm clicking send now. It's going to the publishers. It's ready to go. And so I did this, and I wrote this blog about 25,000, 30,000 odd words, and it got a reasonable amount of traction on their website, and people wrote in, and we had comments and some nice exchanges, and people on social media and stuff. And then when I sent the last post, Carolina, the publisher, called me and said, "So shall we publish this as a book now?" And I sensibly said, "No." Terrible idea. I then had my arm twisted for a little while and agreed to do it. A number of conditions, one of which was that I wouldn't change it. There's a quite long introduction. There's a kind of 15, 20 page, this is what I think of translation introduction, and there's a little afterward, but otherwise it's almost verbatim as it appears on the blog. And it's been an interesting thing to see the reception of something like this. It was written on the blog for people who don't know about translation. I'm explaining it to people who don't know. It was not written to be read by translators or would-be translators. It was really, the people I know who were reading it. I get messages from translator friends saying, "I've just sent that last thing you wrote to my boyfriend. Now he understands why I've been complaining about footnotes," or whatever it is. So a lot of translators shared it with other people, but it wasn't there's nothing in it that you don't know. There's nothing new in it, right? It became slightly different when it appeared as a book, and people started reading it, on university courses and things. Just very alarming. Translation courses, very, very concerning. But also, I became aware of a totally unexpected function it had, which was a lot of translator friends read it sort of when the blog was complete and then when it appeared as a book. people who know much more about translation, who are much more insightful and much more, who think, I think, much more originally about translation than I do, read it and loved it, not because it gave them anything new, but because it gave them reassurance. I think. And I got, just every day or two, I get a message from some, translator I admire enormously saying, "Oh, your drafts are even worse than mine." Or like, I'm so glad I'm not the only person who hates prepositions.
Yes.
I mean, that's the sort of level we're on. So it's become this other sort of thing, and it's had, it wasn't, the New York Times liked it. New York Times is like an actual newspaper. It's very peculiar.
I think it's partly your name, Danny, I have to say. Come on.
I mean, the New York Times has no way of knowing who I am, and yet there we are.
Okay, so read a bit.
I will read a bit. There's a bit, I marked a post, which will take just, I think, 3-4 minutes, which is, I said that I do that first draft really quickly. I leave loads of gaps, words in the original, and things that need to be looked up. There's always research to do. I look all those things up, and then this is where we are, 30th of March. Hallelujah. This feels like progress. I've looked up most of the things I needed to look up, and I've made a few small choices. There is still a lot missing, and many, many edits ahead, but at least the manuscript now actually looks like the draft of a novel, and no longer like an explosion in a multilingual nonsense factory. So, well, that's something. A few of the things I've been reminded of in the last days. 1. If I'm honest, sometimes when choosing between a couple of options for a word, one of the criteria that plays a part is simply which word I like the most. Today I had one of those rare cases where I was struggling because I basically really like both alternatives. So is the narrator's approach going to be furtive or stealthy? This language spoils me sometimes. I also like the word baleful enough that I found myself trying quite hard to crowbar it into a sentence where it probably doesn't belong, though it's great, isn't it? 2, bread is, for a seemingly simple noun, surprisingly hard to translate. Spanish, you will know this problem. 3, English does great verbs. I just took a phrase which in Spanish was something like, I pulled up with great and abrupt strength, and translated it as, I yanked. Other words continue frustratingly to non-exist, however. I need an adjective to describe a person who is waiting for something, which isn't waiting, which doesn't give any indication as to whether they think the thing they await will be good, expectant, or bad, apprehensive. If you have any suggestions, I'll be here sitting waitingly. 4, prepositions are really annoying. 5, we usually rely on context to tell us which of 2 or more possible meanings is the most likely. So while I learned this week, for example, that the word palo not only means stick, but is used specifically in Chile to refer to 1,000,000 pesos, nonetheless, going on probability, the scene in which a character is badly beaten with a palo almost certainly intends the first meaning, and she isn't, I'm pretty confident, being viciously assaulted with large wads of banknotes. A few new things I have learned. The point I just made about being able to deduce meanings from context doesn't always work if you have a writer who actively enjoys using words in unlikely ways. This is, and will continue to be, a problem. There are even 2 instances of words in this book which, if it were any other writer, I'd think they were typos for very similar but much more obvious words. But here, maddeningly, I can't be sure. More on this to come. 2, alero is the Spanish for eaves. Another lovely new word to forget before the week is up. 3, car accidents seem to be dealt with differently in Chile, in legal terms, something to do with judges. Haven't grasped this yet, still pending further investigation. For the Brazilian translation of this book, which I mentioned a few days ago, includes 2 translator footnotes, one of them to explain what a frentista is, as per my February 1st entry, and one to gloss the wrist and doll wordplay from my entry on March 4th. I have unreasonably strong feelings about using footnotes, but wonder whether this is a book in which I should maybe just get over myself I did use a couple of them in my first book translation 1,000 years ago and have managed to avoid them since, but I could, I suppose, make an exception. There is a footnote here. I am slightly compromised, though. I once casually remarked to an author that I considered a footnote in a translated novel to be an admission of defeat. The author then quoted me saying exactly this in one of his books, and that book in question is now appearing in English this summer. The moral of which is never say anything to authors. And 5, there are several, the fifth thing that I learned is that there are several more or less singable in English translations of the Internationale, and I don't really love any of them. Tomorrow I start reading. Having put all the various slippery bits back into the novel and sewn it all up again, now is the stage when I find out if the patient still has a pulse. I'll let you know.
Brilliant.
Palo was a monetary unit in Chile?
Yeah, it's a did I say 1 million pesos, I think? Oh, yeah. So I think it's a slang thing.
Yeah.
But it's a wad of money, basically.
Yeah.
It's a large
So
amount
you
of
could
money.
actually beat someone up with it.
You could, if it were compact and yeah.
Yes. Now, I'm very aware that we have very little time left, and I'm sure there are some questions. If there aren't, I have another question, but I'll let the audience have a go first. Now, if you could speak up loudly so that you can it'll be on the recording as well, if possible.
Hello.
I find it really exciting. You're looking at your bibliography, all the different kind of stuff you do, and the range of the popular and the literary and stuff. I'm wondering how you feel your instincts are at this point about what is going to take off and be popular, and like how that compares to what was popular in the original language, that kind of thing.
I mean, I never know what's going to be popular. I mean, I not only don't know what will be, it's never the things I want to be, or rarely the things I want to be. I mean, one of the reasons I was pleased that this particular book is on the Weidenfeld long list is because I think that book was neglected compared to what it deserved. I think there are some things that are obvious because if you're translating a football memoir, it's because someone's paid a lot of money and they're going to sell 100,000 hardbacks, and that's what it's for. Its function is to sell, a lot of copies. The things I translate most are, at least when I'm doing fiction, I'm doing, for want of a better word, literary fiction, relatively literary fiction, where even the things that are selling well are not selling terribly well. I mean, none of the novels I've translated that I would consider, none of the best novels I've translated have sold, more than 10, 15,000, and those are the outliers already. I've done a very small number of things that have done much better than that. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they just have really big marketing campaigns, sometimes they have a lot of hype because they did incredibly well in one or many other countries.
Children's books?
Children's books, which are probably my favorite thing to do, but they don't on the whole sell. Not in numbers, or at least mine don't sell in large numbers. My children's books tend to be the ones that are borrowed from libraries much more than my grown-up books. So I know my library loans are substantially bulked up by a small number of children's picture books that are much more popular in libraries than almost any fiction I've done for grown-ups. I think there are some kinds of book for which success in market A will tell you something about how it will do in market B, but I don't think most books follow that. I don't think most transitions are that tidy. One of the things that's always interesting when you're pitching a book to a publisher is not to say, here's a book from Portugal, it sold X thousand copies in Portugal, but here's a book from Portugal, it's done very well, but also it's sold really well in Denmark, sold really well in Germany, actually in Nordic countries are doing very well, massive bestseller in Romania or wherever. The sense that this is a book that has the potential to do well in more than one market. The things that do well just in a domestic market, there are so many different reasons for that might be the case. But I wish I knew.
Does it make a difference if you have a relationship with a whole lot of different publishers?
I mean, it certainly helps. I work with lots of different people and I have have quite sustained relationships with publishers in 4 or 5 countries. I've done a lot, a number of books with Scribe here and with Gecko in New Zealand, and lots of publishers in the UK and the US and Canada as well. But often each of those is quite particular. There's quite a particular kind of book. I've done 3 non-fiction books translated from Spanish for Scribe, one on my own, and then the 2 Millás co-translations with Tom. Gecko do children's books. I've done lots of picture books for them, mostly from French, even though I translate from French much less. The picture books I do for Gecko tend to be books from French. So the relationships tend to cover slightly different territory, but it certainly makes a difference. Even though translation isn't the only job I do, it is the thing that pays my mortgage. I don't have an actual job like a sensible person. And so I do need to produce, I need to do 5 decent-sized books a year. That's what I need to live on. And that's not difficult in the sense of doing the work, but it's quite hard to, there isn't that much work to get.
Yeah.
And so the reason I'm able to make a living is not because I do work reasonably fast, but it's also because I'm in a fortunate position to have 4 or 5 books
So
to do.
4 or 5 consecutively, or all on at once?
Well, I will do, a draft of one and all the edits and deliver it before I start the next one. But the one that I've just delivered, it's not dead yet. This is the thing, that you think it's done.
Yeah, no, it's not.
And then there is this really weird zombie thing that every 3 months it reappears in your inbox.
Yes.
With,
Yes.
First edits and then, copy edits and then proofs and then jacket design and blurb, and then it comes out and you're promoting it. So, there was a point, I've just published several books kind of back to back in the last couple of months, but there was a point at the beginning of this year when I had, I think, 10 books that I had delivered to publishers but had not come out yet. And any of them, any of them would, reappear. Usually, what happens is 8 of them appear on the same Friday. Suddenly has to be done, ideally by the beginning of Monday. Yeah.
So you're not juggling 5 different authors at once.
I'm not producing a new translation of more than one book. Sometimes there's a bit of that because but there's a bit of overlap, and I'll stop and do a picture book for a couple of days in the middle of something, and I will do an extract of a novel, which I may not translate for 2 years, but I want to do an extract now to help the publisher acquire it, or because it's the Frankfurt Book Fair, or someone's applying for a grant, whatever it might be. But there tends to be one main book that I am translating, but one main sort of book-length thing that I'm translating. But actually, the thing that I'm working on now, one of the reasons it is running late is because of all those things that I thought were done. Mm-hmm. And
yes.
Yes. There's a bit of that, whack-a-mole thing.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, Elizabeth, and then...
Oh, no, I wasn't.
Okay.
I think there were some other questions coming.
I wanted to ask precisely about that zombie days. How do you find, obviously they're very different people, but that relationship with the editor at the publishing house and the triangle that's then created between perhaps you, the editor, and the original author?
The editing phase is, I love being edited normally. Having done about 100 books, I can think of 2 where I think the edits did more harm than good. But those are good odds, right? The great majority are cases where I think the edit's has really enriched the work. And actually, Brian and I were talking about this earlier. I think I deliver my translations, I think, at sometimes a slightly less finished stage than some of my friends do. I deliver them when they feel a bit malleable and when I'm happy for people to kick them around a bit. As a result, I think if I'm better now than 15 years ago, it's because I've been really well edited, and that's what I've learned from. I've learned from people who are able to articulate what they experience when they're reading the translation, so they're not just correcting my spelling, which is on the whole very good. What they're doing is they're able to look at a sentence and go, there's a problem with the sentence, and let me tell you what it is. There's something about, there's an ambiguity that's unintentional, there's something in the cadence that doesn't work. And so I've benefited a lot from working with some really great editors. I still find myself sometimes being resistant for reasons of, I'm sure, ego and other things. There was a book I translated called Phenotypes by a Brazilian writer called Paulo Scott, great novel, which was shortlisted for the Booker longlisted for the Booker two years ago. And I did a very hard book to translate. I did my translation, and I got edits back from Jeremy Davis, who was at Another Stories in those days. And I sort of opened the file, the Word document on my laptop, and kind of looked at it for about 10 seconds, closed it again, and thought, like, okay, this is the worst bit of the process. And then I went back to it and opened it again 2 days later and discovered that actually the worst bit of the process is looking at it and going, oh, he's right. God, almost everything he says is right. Not everything. I mean, typically what happens is I will accept 70% of the changes, and I will reject 15% of the changes, and there'll be 15% where I'll look at what they've said and go, I can see why you have a problem with it, but actually I have a different solution. So I'm going to do something which is, I'm going to take, I'm going to do something to it, which I hope will solve the problem. I don't think what you're suggesting quite works for whatever reason. Having said that, I got some edits in my inbox today, and I haven't looked at them, and I may throw a tantrum. I don't know. It's a novel I like very much, and it's an editor I like very much, so I think we'll be okay.
Any other questions?
I was wondering, because you work with Portuguese and Spanish, which, as you mentioned, aren't restricted to just one small country, how do you approach multilingualism? So like the different varieties of Portuguese and Spanish, or even if, for instance, a certain character maybe speaks a little bit of Spanish and Portuguese, like if there's any kind of overlap there, do you feel the need to sort of domesticate it into like this person's vaguely British and this person's vaguely American, or like, do you have any kind of strategies that you tend to fall back on?
It's an interesting question. If the book is kind of coherently one Spanish or one Portuguese, I do nothing to it, because the fact that it happens to be Angolan or Brazilian or Portuguese or Cape Verdean, whatever, isn't on the whole going to influence the kind of English I use. But it does often happen that there is a mix, there is some kind of friction between different versions of the language. The most extreme version of which was a Mexican novelist I translated a few years ago called Juan Pablo Villalobos, whom I like very much. He's mostly translated by Rosalind Harvey, who's a great translator. And Rosalind couldn't do this one particular book called I Don't Expect Anyone to Believe Me. So I got to sort of understudy her for just this one book. And I Don't Expect Anyone to Believe Me is about, it's now a very good Netflix movie, as it turns out. It's about a Mexican student called Juan Pablo Villalobos also, who comes to Catalonia, lives in Catalonia, and he speaks Mexican Spanish, and many of the people around him speak Castilian Spanish, but they also speak a bit of Catalan, and their Castilian is inflected with Catalan, and his flatmate is from Argentina, and his ex-girlfriend's best friend is Italian but speaks Spanish with a bit of an Italian kind of inflection, and there are all kinds of things that are happening to Spanish, and I can't pretend it's not happening because they all also talk about it. Because they tease each other for because you use this word rather than that word. And the first decision is I'm not going to make these people be from Dublin and these people be from Detroit and these people be from Canberra. Because, I mean, in the abstract, that's a good idea, but actually, I think it's a terrible idea. Because the last thing you want to be doing is, I mean, there's that really bizarre sense, I think, that if you're trying to persuade someone that this thing is set in Barcelona, and suddenly this group of characters are from Baltimore for reasons I don't quite understand. You know, it's like suddenly, I had just been watching The Wire, and so everyone's going to talk like they're in The Wire suddenly. It'll be a very peculiar and very unhelpful thing to do for a reader. But I have to find ways of making them different. But those things won't be marked. They won't be things that you can map. They'll be to do with register. They'll be to do with little phrases which, like, only the Catalan-speaking characters will use this little phrase. It'll be a question of how there's a lot of, I mean, I think this is true about most Mexican novels, massive amounts of swearing, and they all swear slightly differently. So at the very end, I went through and made sure that, like, you know, such and such a word, which I'm not going to say because we're being recorded, is only being used, like the Argentine character, because they swear differently in Argentina to Mexico to whatever. So there are little markers. You can tell that these people are part of a tribe, and these people are part of a different tribe. You don't think this tribe is obviously from Massachusetts, and then this one is obviously people who are from Glasgow and the area around Glasgow. But you can tell that they are marked. One of the things that is tricky in that case is that there is a perceived hierarchy. So there's a point where, there's more than one point where the Spanish characters are very dismissive of the Mexican characters because their language is inferior somehow. There's one incredibly difficult thing. The last thing I did before delivering the book was solve one particular problem, one example of that. But again, there's no point going, well, we're going to have, you know, someone from Edinburgh looking down on someone from New York, whatever. But you need to replicate the power dynamic. You don't have to replicate exactly that relationship, but you need to find some way of making the thing that this person says feel like it's somehow a condescending version of what this other person says. Very hard.
Yeah, difficult, yeah.
Did you find an equivalent in the target language between those language varieties?
Yeah, you have to find some equivalent, not necessarily a thing that you can map, you know, like topographically, but just I can just tell you that example quickly. That particularly difficult one was a moment in which, near the end of the book, the main character's girlfriend, who's from Catalonia, has an argument, kind of a row on the street with the ex-girlfriend who is from Mexico, and the ex-girlfriend says to the girlfriend, this relationship isn't real for you, it's just some part, she's an art student. You're just doing it, it's like some kind of performance piece. And the girlfriend says, what do you mean a performance piece? It's whatever. One of the things I discovered when I was translating this book, which I cannot explain, in Spanish they use the word performance, meaning a performance piece. And performance is, let me get this right, a masculine noun in Mexico and a feminine noun in Spain. I think it's that way around. So in Mexico they say un performance. In Spain they say una performance. For reasons, you know. And what happens in the scene is that the first character says, the whole thing is just un performance for you. And the other one says, what do you mean una performance? It's nothing of the kind. So she doesn't draw attention to it. But on some level, she's correcting her. Yeah. You know, on some level, she's quoting her back to her with a slight adjustment because my Spanish is like proper Spanish. So you say un performance, and I say it's not una performance at all. And so there is something there that is. In a way, the language is irrelevant, but the point is that it's about the power and it's about the condescension. It's about how this person feels about the relative sophistications or purities or whatever of their language. And so what I needed to do was something that couldn't be the same, because obviously we can't do that in English, but something, it ended up being, I was quite pleased with this. I stole this idea from my friend Victor, who I should credit. Basically, the first character says something like, as if it was a performance piece. And when the girl quotes her back, she says, as if it were, rather than as if it was.
Yes.
And as if it were is right, but also mostly you say that in order to show off the fact that you know it's right. Like people say as if it was much more frequently.
Yes.
But if you said as if it was, and I say, well, I don't know why you think as if it were. It's a way of just, and it's almost invisible, and I don't think anyone noticed it. I mean, actually, I wrote a translator's note in this book, and I said, I'm particularly pleased with my solution to such and such, to a problem on page 187. And people keep coming up to me going, I can't find it. I mean, I told them which page it's on. I did this thing, a really, really clever thing. I mean, it's a good one. I'm really pleased with that. Absolutely unable to find it. So it's very, but also it's almost invisible in the Spanish as well. And most people won't know it's in Spanish.
Yeah.
I should just say quickly,
Or think it's a typo.
Or think it's a typo. Wherever you are in the Spanish-speaking world, you'll think one of those people has got it wrong. I will just say, just very quickly to finish, that one of the reasons I think I spent a lot of time on that, I got to I'd basically finished the draft, had a Zoom conversation with Juan Pablo and asked him some questions, and I asked him about that one particular thing. And he said, he explained it to me and then said, but actually it's fine, you'll never find a solution to it, just ignore it. And Juan Pablo is himself a translator, and I think he knew exactly what he was doing when he said that. Because obviously I thought, right, well, fuck you, I'm going to... If you think I'm going to... Yes, if it takes the rest, So, yeah.
Look, I'm sorry, but we are going to have to finish because they're going to throw us out. And some of us still have to rearrange the room. So please join me. I know we all have a million other things we would have loved to have discussed. You'll have to come back.
I'd love to come back.
Good.
Part 2.
Please join me in thanking Danny.
Thank you. Thank you.